In 2008, Mazda, a car company, shut down its plant in the eastern suburb of Adelaide called Eastbourne. 2,600 people were immediately put out of work as a result of that. The vast majority of them still are looking for work. That town of Eastbourne on the outskirts of Adelaide in Australia, sorry for the Australian example, but in Australia, remains desolate to this day. The town was reliant on that company. It even named its local football team the Zoom Zoom. That was their brand name. Such was their connection to the Mazda brand. The government had invested in training those workers as technicians for the Mazda power plant. The government had invested in building roads from Adelaide to that suburb so that those workers could work there. And Mazda, looking solely to the interests of profit, packed up and left, foregoing all its responsibility to its workers and to the government that put it there. We want to end that sort of corporate greed. What we're going to do, very simple, we're going to force these companies like Mazda and like any other company that wants to leave, examples could be given all around the world, to pay the social security, the welfare of the rate of those people in that country for a period of 2 years. We're also going to force them to pay for the retraining of workers. Two arguments from me. Firstly, why companies have this responsibility and why the government must force them to fulfill this responsibility. Firstly, we argue that companies have a general responsibility to do more than just make profit. We don't think that any company has an inherent economic right to profit. We give them that right based on the utility that comes from that. We give them the right because it is good for the people of the country, the people of the world generally, that companies are profit-seeking. We do not think anyone has an inherent right to that profit for reasons that they can't make that profit by themselves. They can't make that profit without the support of the workers and the communities around them and the governments that facilitate that and the trade networks that facilitate that. Therefore, because they're relying on these things, that right is not inherent. But furthermore, we think specifically in these examples, these companies have a right to look out for the interests of these workers. We think the rights of workers are worthless when companies can just pack up and leave and deny them all rights at once. So these workers have shown loyalty in most cases to this company. These companies are built in towns generally. We're talking largely of infrastructure projects where there is great brand loyalty in those towns, where those towns are built around supporting that industry. But also, these companies have a responsibility to people who consume their products in these countries, because it is that brand name support and the general goodwill towards that country that allows them to make that profit in the first place. But also, they've got a responsibility to governments, because it's the government that actually facilitates their operations. The government builds infrastructure, like in Adelaide when they built the roads out there. But also, for example, another Australian example, but Bonds, when it set up, Australian example, after it set up its factories in Australia, there was a huge influx of government funding for TAFE programs in order to facilitate the sort of skills that those companies needed. Those companies' profit rode on the back of government assistance and the assistance of towns and communities. Therefore, they have a responsibility to give it back to those places. These companies run freedoms of sorts, where they run the town. They're in charge, they're a sort of pseudo-government in these towns, and we think they have more of a responsibility than just their profit. They also have a responsibility to those workers who allow them to be there and make profit in the first place. We'll take a point from closing.
Would you place a liability on companies that incidentally make workers redundant due to technological advancements?
No, we wouldn't. We think there are some instances where companies do naturally need to move forward. We think what we're talking about here is companies packing up all together and shipping off all their operations at once, where they pack up wholesale. We think those sort of slow, incremental changes are inevitable. We think they are part of the cost of making profit. We think there is an interest in making profit. We think the workplace is never going to be perfect. People are always going to be made redundant in some forms. But this sort of wholesale changes, which come at a particularly hopeful time, as I'm going to explain in a second, are something that we can crack down on. Second argument from me is going to be about the economic impact of this. And I've got three things to say about this. Firstly, why this happens at the worst possible time. Secondly, why structural unemployment is so damaging and must be stopped. And thirdly, why we're not worried about these companies moving to the developed world, because we think these companies packing up and moving at will is actually bad for the global economy as a whole. Firstly, why this happens at the worst possible time. The context in which these companies pack up is generally in financial crisis. So they pack up when labour gets too expensive because they need to go and find cheaper labour. They also pack up when there is a failing economy, so there's less of a market, domestic market, near those factories. So they pack up because of that. They also pack up when workers are generally demanding more rights. That worsens the crises at the worst possible time. When these workers have the least amount of ability to find other work, when there are very few jobs around, that is when these companies pack up. And that is why the government must intervene. We've already seen governments intervene in these crises to limit the rights of companies and aid companies in the last few years. We think this is merely an extension of that. Governments have a role to remedy the effects of these crises. They must do it. People around the globe, people in America, like in the bailouts and all around the world, have demanded this government response. We think it's an extension of that. I'll take a point for a moment.
So, if it is the case that you believe these are the worst economic times in which these sorts of crises occur, do you think it is good to put a very large, long-standing cost on companies who are often leaving because otherwise they will have to go bankrupt?
Yeah, well, we acknowledge that this isn't the best thing for company profits. Companies will make less money because of this. They will forcibly stay in a place where they're not making the most money that they possibly could. But we're willing to bear that cost for the sake of these people, because we think having people unemployed is a worse cost than having these companies for a couple of years not ticking over the best bottom line. Second reason why we're not too worried about the economic impact, why we actually think this has a good economic impact, is because structural employment is so damaging. It is incredibly hard to retrain someone who has worked 40 years in the one industry, who's worked 40 years doing textile work and making clothes, who's worked 40 years as an electrician in a car factory, and now has to retrain for, who knows, as a scientist, a sort of new age 21st century job that can't be done at a whim. And most of the time we're talking about 40, 50, 60-year-olds who don't have the capacity to be retrained at short notice. That means they end up unemployed for years and years and years. Thirdly, on economic impact, why we're not worried about these companies moving to the developed world. Because what this means, even when they move to the developing world, sorry, not the developed world, that creates a race to the bottom. It means that countries, that when they can just move at will across the world, that gives them unfair power in wage negotiations. It means that these companies can push wages down and down and down, and across the globe, in the developed and the developing world, wages become less and less and less, and they can't purchase the things that they need to. For those two reasons, because companies have a responsibility to more than just profit, because this will help the economy in a crisis. We're proud to progress.